one more
Oh.
thing checked and we done.
Yep, yep. One more thing checked. Okay.
Well, all right then. Well, how's everybody feeling? Y'all good? Everybody good? Good, good. Glad to be in the land of the living? That's what I'm talking about, you know. They got this organization around here in New Orleans that they always say their motto is "You next." You know what I'm saying? Wow, yeah? Okay. Well, my name is Bruce SUNPIE Barnes. This is Mark Stone. We're happy to be here in the Tennessee Williams Festival. That's what this is? Talking about the blues. Anybody ever had them? Yeah, you know, it's a living condition, real or fictitious. You either went through it yourself or you've seen somebody else go through it or saw it on Snapchat. But it's a
Or
real
you're putting
thing.
someone else through it, you know.
Yeah. So, Mark, what's the subject matter for this this program that we're here with these good people with today?
Delta blues and how it relates to Louisiana.
Delta blues and how it relates to Louisiana. Okay.
I just made that up. I don't know. I mean,
But I'm gonna stick with it now. So, well, how would you like to proceed? You want to do some
Yeah, just start.
pontification or some music?
yeah, you started up, Bruce.
Oh, music. All right. So there's a young lady up in the front in the middle here. She was like, "Let's chat and let's music." Well, I'll tell you what. Let's do a little number here, and this is something that luckily we all get to participate in together, right? You know, we all have different experiences around music and blues music and all these things like that, but I think in a lot of ways, it just speaks to a lot of memories and emotions. You know, that's what music does for people. And if we're talking about the Delta, I believe the Delta is one of those well springs that gave forth a tremendous amount of music to the universe. And if we're talking about the Delta, then I guess to really think about it is like it is the part of the Mississippi River that starting around Brownsville, Tennessee, where the river starts to reverse the action that it has, right? So the Delta is where the river itself is above the surrounding landscape. So the water stops flowing into the river, starts flowing the other direction. So you don't have tributaries flowing into it. really, in a conventional way. You have distributaries, even though there are some larger bodies of water that still do that. So it's like other deltas in places. So it's kind of like the delta. And so a lot of people think about the delta, they say that's over Mississippi. But that's not really true, because the river has two banks, right? So the delta is all of that area that's in that deltaic plain, where the water on the river is above the surrounding landscape in that big giant floodplain that has, and it does whatever it wants. It's also one of those places where people were, brought into for agricultural reasons, and then a whole bunch of other stuff. But let's do a little song together. I heard this when I was a kid, by like my relatives and so forth. And when I was 16 years old, my father got me a job cutting wood. He was like, I'm gonna make a man out of you this year. So it was logging, with an axe, black diamond axe, double bit axe, and one of those big long blades that they call a Pulaski, but they had different names for it. So, you had to use the music that you incorporated into the songs to survive the work experience. So we're gonna clap our hands, for example, and imagine cutting down a 3,000-year-old cypress tree. This is what people was doing. So these trees were big. They were as wide as from this post right here to that post over there, even wider, one tree, 15 feet wide at the breast of the tree. Knees on it that were 9 feet tall. So you had to fall that tree some kind of way. And the whole delta was like this on the lower end, which is kind of like what we're talking about in a sense. So swinging axe blades, cutting fallen trees using what they call a paspatu, a big saw. All that was very dangerous work. So you had to coordinate the work with the instrument that was in your hand. And to keep people from getting killed or injured very seriously, they used music and song to, with a, call and response, with a lead call and then a response had to come immediately from all those other people working, because you're sinking the axe blade into a tree. So we're just gonna clap our hands and imagine swinging that axe blade and sinking it into that cypress tree to fall it. So we all work together on this. It's done by the inflection of your voice, and you can't hold back. If you don't sing or you don't respond, guess what? You might lose your hand, your arm, or your head. It's straight up true. So let's try it together. It's a little something called Look Yonder Where the Sun's Ain't Going. So people would sing this song in the around about like 6 o'clock in the evening when the sun's going down, because it was hard, treacherous work. They were being forced to do it with no pay and no restitution. So they would sing that song in defiance of what they were being subjected to. And they were basically saying that it's Mother Nature that rules over all. When the sun's going down, we about to stop working. So let's try it. Look yonder, oh, look yonder. Well, look yonder, where the sun done gone. Oh, look yonder, oh, look yonder. Oh, look yonder, where the sun done gone. Oh, Captain can't hold 'em. Oh, Captain can't hold 'em. Well, Captain can't hold 'em. Now the sun done gone. Oh, look yonder. Oh, look yonder. Well, look yonder, where the sun done gone. Oh, I just walking, Lord, I just walking. Well, I just walking, now the sun done gone. And Chip just talking, oh, Chip just talking. Well, Chip just talking, now the sun done gone. Well, if I could, I surely would stand on the rock where Moses stood. There's a line in, ha, oh Lord, keep a line in, ha, oh Lord, keep a line in, ha, oh Lord, just a line in, ha, oh Lord, Jackie Rabbit, ha, Jack the Hare, just a little bit, ha, right there, keep a line in, ha, oh Lord, keep a line in, ha, oh Lord. Well, Moses stood on the Red Sea shore, smoothing that water with a 2x4, just lining. Ha! Oh Lord, keep a lining. Ha! Oh Lord, keep a lining. Ha! Oh Lord, just a lining. Ha! Oh Lord, Jack the Rabbit. Ha! Jack the Hare, just a little bit. Ha! Right there, keep a lining. Ha! Oh Lord, keep a lining. Ha! Oh Lord. Well, Moses stood on the Red Sea shore, smoking that water with a 2x4, just lining. Oh Lord, keep a lining. Ha! Oh Lord, Jack the Rabbit. Ha! Jack the Hare, just a little bit. Ha! Right there, keep a lining. Ha! Oh Lord, just a lining. Ha! Oh Lord. Well, what did the hen duck say to the drake? No more crawfish in this lake. Keep flying. Ha! Oh Lord, keep it flying. Ha! Oh Lord, keep it flying. Ha! Oh Lord, keep it flying. Ha! Oh Lord. Well, that's kind of like the idea, but y'all was a little timid. You're working like you're in a library club or something. But it's all right, you know. That's how it is the first time you pick up a Black Diamond X. But those songs became songs that people used to create ways to survive. You know, they were kind of like OSHA-approved work songs that folks had to use to figure out a way to be able to get rid of the drudgery of a 16 or 17-hour workday, as well as to survive all the treacherous work that they were doing themselves. So it became one of those elements that's a part of blues. I'm just throwing something in this blues pot that we can work with and you know, get our mindset on like what it is, where it came from. Yeah, I'll turn it over to my distinguished colleague, Mark Stone, and I know he's got something good to say or play.
All right. Let me switch a reel here. So, during the period that Delta blues really takes shape, you have to remember that Delta blues is it's a style, and it's something that evolved well into the period that blues already existed in, you know, various forms. I know Chris Thomas King is coming in next to talk about his new book, where he argues that blues in many ways was born in New Orleans, which of course was an urban center and very different than the rural places that we think of when we think about Delta blues. But you know, the early 20th century was a time of tremendous technological expansion and innovation, and of course you have, for the first time, widely available recorded music starting in the 1920s. And that means that all of a sudden, these songs that people had could be condensed down into these, you know, basically 3-minute entities, or maybe 2 sides of a 78 if they wanted to do part 1 and part 2 of a recording. But it allowed for a more focused presentation of the music, and there's also other technological innovations going on that are driven by things that are going on in popular culture. One of the things that was happening a lot in the 1920s was that Hawaiian music was becoming very popular, and there was a lot of sheet music being sold and recordings being sold, and instruments that used a slide, which really was very popular in Hawaiian music. And you do already have this in the blues culture. You know, W.C. Handy famously reports seeing someone around 1903 in Memphis playing slide with a knife on an instrument in their lap. But, you know, you already have this kind of thing going on from Hawaiian music, where they were playing sliding instruments in their lap, and it became very popular throughout the United States. And another thing that happened was, because you had the advent of recording of popular music, guitars at the time weren't loud enough to be really heard when they were played in conjunction with a full orchestra, a lot of other instruments in a recording situation, because at the time there would just be one horn to kind of capture all the sound in a room. They weren't miking instruments individually. So these two Czech brothers, named the Dopera brothers, came up with the idea of adapting the concept of how a banjo works. You've all seen a banjo and how it has something like a drum skin on the front of it. And when the strings vibrate, that drum skin vibrates, and there's a apparatus under it called a resonator. So the skin under tension is vibrating within the resonator. It's driven by the vibration of the string. It makes it louder and brighter. So they came up with the idea of building these resonator guitars, and not only are a lot of them made of metal, but that's not really the active. That's right. That's not really the active thing that makes them louder and brighter. What you have, if you can see it all through these little holes, is there's a spun piece of aluminum inside this well, a resonator cone, a round cone, and think of it like a speaker cone. Any of you guys ever see inside a speaker? You know, there's just a paper cone, and on the back of it there's a magnet. Wire goes to the magnet, there's an electrical impulse that goes to the magnet, makes the magnet move, it makes the paper cone move, and that translates into sound. So what the Dopera brothers came up with was this concept where you have this metal resonator cone, and on it you have this wooden piece called a biscuit or a cookie, on top of which is a bridge the strings lay on. So when the string vibrates, this whole aluminum cone vibrates, and it makes a very loud, bright sound compared to a wooden acoustic guitar. And this was cutting-edge technology when they came out in 1926, 27 with these. I think the first production National guitars are around 1927, and then they would get sued by their partner and start another company called Dobro. And then we all know the term Dobro is a colloquial term for any kind of instrument, acoustic instrument, resonator instrument that you play in your lap like this. So they came up with this great idea, and for 3 years it was the cutting edge of technology, and then in 1930 the Rickenbacker company starts putting out lap steel guitars with an electronic pickup on it, making these technically obsolete, but the sound was still so cool, and they were very useful to people performing in a rural environment with no electricity or on the street, and because they were self-amplifying and they were good and loud. So, I mean, even getting this mic out of the way. In this room, you guys can all hear that pretty clearly, right? Yeah, this thing's got some pump to it. So that's another technological innovation that definitely influences how we heard Delta blues on, you know, the recordings that were left behind for us to enjoy, you know, nearly 100 years after they were made. And of course, another thing that was going on was the adaptation of spirituals, of songs from the church, into popular form. So I'm going to do one that this song goes back in lots of different elements of this kind of music, and was famously recorded by Mississippi Fred McDowell in the 50s, early 60s, and then adapted by the Rolling Stones. And it goes something like this. I'll just do a little bit of it. You got to move. You got to move. You got to move, child. You got to move. And Lord, get ready. You got to move. You may be high, you may be low, you may be rich, child, you may be poor. When the Lord, He get ready, you got to move. You see that girl, she walked the street, ain't got no shoes, baby, on her feet. When the Lord, He get ready, you got to move. Now, Now, thank you. Robert Johnson would take basically that same melody and form and create a blues tune out of it. And I take it most of you are familiar with the name Robert Johnson, right? One of the more emblematic players of Delta blues. He actually came along at the tail end of the Delta blues era. He doesn't start recording until 1935, by which time the styles are really changing, and you're about to see the advent of jump blues and swing music is coming up throughout the country. Big bands are already very popular. So he's really on the tail end of this acoustic Delta blues movement. But he wasn't a big seller in his time, but as his stuff was discovered later on, because of his incredible technical proficiency and the breadth of styles that he was able to play as a solo musician, and his incredibly haunting voice, he becomes popular with subsequent generations after his death. So anyway, here's a very famous tune that he did, that he wrote using that same melody. It goes something like this. You better come on in my kitchen. Oh, it's gonna be raining outdoors. Took from my best friend. That joker got lucky, stole her back again. He better come on in my kitchen. Oh, it's gonna be raining outdoors. You see, hey, now you better come on in my kitchen. Oh, now it's got to be raining outdoors. When a woman in trouble, they throw her down, looking for that good friend, none can be found. She better come on in my kitchen. Oh, now it's got to be raining outdoors. Hear that wind howl? I hear that wind howl. And you better come on in my kitchen. Oh, now it's got to be raining outdoors.
That was good. Come on in my kitchen. What y'all got to eat? I think I'm gonna switch over here to the piano for a second and talk a little bit about. Y'all doing that right? Everybody. Don't do it. So yeah, I think blues music was like some other things was happening simultaneously in many different places, but it had some definite origin spots. I would say New Orleans is one of them because it was the largest hip city in America, and still is at the time when blues came around. A lot of music a lot of people coming into the city, especially after the emancipation of enslaved Africans. And they brought all sorts of ideas with them, in particular in the central city, but they combined it with things that were already going on here. So I'm gonna just play a little number for you that was like one of my favorite tunes when I was a kid. I had an uncle named SUNPIE. And he was half Blackfoot Indian. He's from a little place called Bastrop, Louisiana. And we played this number right here, the 44 Blues. I learned later about a lot of these records from records because I only heard them at home initially. But, you know, my father and uncles would play this kind of stuff like this. But he was combining some things that's not exactly the way that the man that made the record made it, but I learned later that it was like an old prison camp song, but set to music like a lot of songs were, like work songs that got translated. So I'm gonna try and play it like he would play it, you know, in our little living room. My 44 so long, it made my shoulders sore. Well, I'm just looking for somebody, 'cause I just got to go. Well, I'm so mad this morning, I don't know what in the world to do. Lord, I'm so mad this morning, I don't know what in the world to do. I done wore my 44 so long, I made my shoulders sore. Yeah, every time I walk in my house, I hear my back door slam. Yeah, every time I walk in my house, I hear my back door slam. Well, now look yonder, there goes old creeping Sam. I done wore my 44 so long, I made my shoulders sore. I done wore my 44 so long, it made my shoulders sore. And one of the things that's significant about that is, it really uses a tango format, what became known as a tango. In the left hand, that part of it with that hesitation in it, which is something that was widely used in New Orleans in all sorts of formats. So, lots of early players, but it's also something that was going on in places like Congo Square. People were using rhythms like that to make music happen. So these things kind of, manifest themselves and move out in all sorts of ways throughout the city and I think throughout the Delta also. So, what would you like?
All right.
Wait, do y'all have any questions while we're going along here? Such a quiet, studious group of people, you make me nervous.
All right. One subject that you find a lot in Delta blues is transportation. Getting from point A to point B, getting away from current circumstance. And so I'm going to do a song from 1928, and this has a lot of themes that you find in Delta blues. You find the concept of transportation, of upward mobility, of getting out of your current circumstance, building a better circumstance for yourself. Also romantic and sexual frustration and gender power dynamics and all that, along with some rather weirdly tongue-in-cheek references to all that. This is in the key of E. This is from 1928 by Willie Brown. This is called the M&O Blues. Hey, can we kill the condenser for a second?
Done.
Thank you. Beautiful, thank you. When I leave here now, I catch the M&O. When I leave here now, I'll catch the M&O. I'm going way down south where, good Lord, I've never been before. Well, I'll get me a notion and, good Lord, believe I will. Well, I get me a notion and, good Lord, believe I will. I'm gonna build me a mansion out on Decatur Hill. I say, oh, you men you are, or be ashamed of yourself. I said, oh, you men you are, or be ashamed of yourself. Go around swam by God, you got poor little woman by yourself. Come on, Ruth. I went to kill my baby till she lay down across my bed. Went to kill my baby till she lay down across my bed. She looked so ambitious, took back every word I said. So I asked her how about it, and good Lord, she say all right. When I asked her how about it, and she said all right. But she ain't never show up at the shack last night. Yeah, I know.
That makes me think about another transportation song. We talk about transportation. I think about getting a Lexus, ain't up with a Ford F-150. And Jeep. There's something called back train and get your load. You know, one of those elements that came out of Delta. You know, that can't be separated from blues. Of course, is the spiritual music and all the people who made it. You know, that music is like the stuff that kept people alive. So a little back train and get your load. Well, now back train and get your load. Back train and get your load. Back train, back train, back train and get your load. That's a fire. Well, I thought I heard that church bell tone. Thought I heard that church bell tone. Thought I heard that church bell tone. Just 1 and 5. Well, I'm going home on the morning train. I'm going home on the morning train. I'm going home. Evening train. Evening train might be too late. Back train and get your load. Back train and get your load. Back train. Back train. Back train and get your load. Thought I heard that church bell tone. Thought I heard that church bell tone. Tone just like somebody's gone. Get right, church, and let's go home. Get right, church, and let's go home. Get right, church. Get right, church. Get right, church, and let's go home.
Yes.
Just a question. When did people start playing harmonica in Louisiana, Mississippi music? And
Early.
yeah. And how did that come about? And how affordable were they?
little affordable. Yeah, they were affordable. Harmonicas were invented around 1849 in the conventional sense in Germany. And, 1850 or 51, they were in New Orleans. So they came in, had a large German population of people that were here. And, they were pretty cheap, 2 cents to 5 cents. And one of the more wonderful things is they came with no instructions. So this instrument, also accordions, were kind of here at the same exact time, and it was a novelty instrument. Both of them were. These were a little more than a nickel, and they still are. They came in, and it was a novelty instrument. And yeah, my dad played harmonica, and his uncle played. And I have an uncle that was playing harmonica in the 1860s in Louisiana. But they first were brought in for, to play. And, that was the concept. It was like that music box that you can see in, see in Germany, see in the Netherlands, But, people here started to emulate, the voices, and they did some wonderful things like they did with other instruments. They did it with clarinets, they did it with cornets, they did it with everything around here. They started bending notes, so instead of... I want a drink of water, mama. Emulating trains, doing all those things that, set this instrument on its pathway to being a hot seller around the world. And then, in other places, people were also finding their voices in folk instruments, or what became folk instruments, putting, kind of songs that were folk traditional songs. It didn't matter. You could do what you wanted to with it. But, the blues itself is like, Horner can thank the folks in the Delta for figuring out what to do with this thing to make it, talk in a different way. So, yeah.
Also worth noting that the term harmonica comes from the German term Mundharmonika, which means mouth harmonicas, because the harmonica is actually a derivation of the accordion. They're both invented around the same time and work on similar principles. So around the same time that you have that, you also have the big brother instrument, the accordion, popping up wherever you had German immigrants all through Louisiana.
Yeah, and both of these were kind of derivatives of African Chinese bamboo instruments that were reeded instruments, and these are brass, so they last a little bit. Probably not as long, actually, but they react differently to the weather for sure. Yeah.
So, in the key of A, here's a song that Muddy Waters originally wrote when he was still a tractor driver on a farm in the Delta. And he's from the Clarksdale, Mississippi area, and it's worth noting how much great music came out of there. Not just Delta blues, but then rock and roll pioneers like Ike Turner. And at the same time that you had Son House and Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters all emerging over the course of 15 or 20 years, in the Clarksdale area, you also had Leontine Price, the great opera singer, the woman who would break down all the barriers in the world of opera as a black woman from Mississippi who was not at all welcome into the world of opera when she first entered and would go on to become one of the greatest divas in the world. So it's amazing the wellspring of music that little area of Mississippi would be and what a broad impact it would have. And Muddy Waters first recorded when Alan Lomax came to the Delta, making field recordings for the Library of Congress. and he recorded a song that he had written called I Be's Troubled. And when he heard a number of other songs, including his variation of Son House's Walking Blues, and Son House, of course, was a mentor to him. And he said when he heard the playback of those field recordings made on Alan Lomax's portable recording machine, which was a 300-pound device in the trunk of his car, he realized that he really had something as a singer, and not long after moved to Chicago in search of fame and fortune in the music world. And he was trying to play what was the contemporary hot style of the time, which would be jump blues, which is a little more swing-oriented, a little more jazz-oriented, kind of single notes on the guitar, and along the lines of what T-Bone Walker or Louis Jordan would have been doing at the time. And he didn't have any success, and then he went back to the Delta and came back up to Chicago, and in 1948, for a company called Aristocrat Records, owned by Phil and Leonard Chess and partners of theirs, he took this song that he had written in the Delta. He had never really recorded anything of Delta origin previously because he was trying to be the hip thing of the time and trying to play this, more swing-oriented blues and a more modern guitar style. He took this song that he had written on an acoustic guitar, took a new electric guitar, plugged it into an amplifier, cranked up to death, got a very fat, distorted sound for the time, and I'll try and emulate to that to some degree with this. And they put that song out, and it was a huge hit with all of the folks from the Delta diaspora that had moved north in search of less oppression and better paying work in the industrial world as opposed to the farming world. So he puts this song out, and he's got an upright bass player named Big Crawford playing this wonderful slap bass line that was pretty innovative for the time. And it was a huge hit, sold out its first pressing almost instantly, and ultimately would give the Chess brothers the money to buy out their partners and start Chess Records and start the whole Chicago electric blues and rock and roll revolution that would happen in the late 40s going into the 50s. That's not the very beginning of electric recording of blues, but when we think of what happened with Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and that really dirty, hard electric blues sound that came out of Chicago as this Delta sound adapted to its modern, urban, industrialized environment, it really struck a nerve with the population there. So this is that song. This is called I Can't Be Satisfied. Down south, child, don't you wanna go? You know I'm trouble. All boy mine. Well, I can't be satisfied, and I can't keep from crying. Feel like slapping my pistol in your face. I'm gonna let that graveyard be her resting place. You're not trouble, I wouldn't mind. Well, I'm never satisfied, and I can't keep from crying. Yeah, Bruce. Oh, my little baby, sure gonna jump a child. I don't chain be late, yes, and I come walking out in no trouble. I wouldn't mind. Knowing this world I'm satisfied, and I just can't keep from. Well, technically we're over time, but I think we should let Chris. Okay to let Bruce take it out one more? No.
Well, like I said at the beginning, the Delta is like the Mississippi. It's deep and wide. Lots of ends to it. While all this other stuff was going on, that was certainly. We're just gonna do a little something here. This is a little number to get the stage warmed up for Chris gets here. Let's do this up in Baton Rouge, which is like a huge center for music as well. So I would say that commercialization of music and engineers and contracts have driven like a lot of the knowledge that people have of what happened in one place or another. It's gonna be an F. You know the hoodoo king and the hoodoo queen. Go to little party down in New Orleans. Had a little scream and I turned around. Cadillac Slim had just rolled into town. Now boogie chillin'. Yeah, boogie baby. Well now boogie woogie chillin'. Boogie till the break of dawn. Yeah, the hoodoo king and the hoodoo queen. Go to little party down in New Orleans. Had a little scream and I turned around. Cadillac Slim, it just rolled into town. Now boogie chillin'. Well, boogie baby. Well now boogie woogie chillin'. Boogie till the break of dawn. Yeah, the king and queen was all dressed in red. They had 24 diamonds all around their head. Her sister Brown Taylor, Sioux City Sue. Well, Slim don't move me like he used to do. Now boogie chillin'. Yeah, boogie baby. Well now boogie woogie chillin'. Boogie till the break of dawn. Come on and boogie. Yeah, boogie baby. Oh, now boogie. Well, boogie. Well, now boogie woogie chillin'. Boogie till the break of dawn. Yeah, they rock and roll till the break of day. 2 by 2, you know they all walked away. Everybody was wondering when the king and queen would boogie again. Now boogie chillin'. Yeah, boogie baby. Well now boogie woogie chillin'. Boogie till the break of dawn. that number from Tabitha Thomas. Thank you so much, y'all.
Thank you, everybody. One more time, Bruce SUNPIE Barnes. My name's Mark Stone. I want to thank the Tennessee Williams Festival and the museum for having us. Stick around for Chris Thomas King doing an interview about his new book. And if you're still in this neighborhood around 10 o'clock tonight, I'll be celebrating my birthday with a show with a bunch of friends right down the street at DBA. Peace and love, y'all. We'll catch you next time.
sounded great. I enjoyed that. Yeah.
Except for that hoodoo party song, man. Whoever wrote that?
Yeah, for those that don't know, that was the last song they did was a song written by my dad, Tabby Thomas. It was nice. It was a nice treat to hear them do that. So, yeah.
All right. My name is David Kunian. I'm the curator here at the New Orleans Jazz Museum, and I'm the curator for the Louisiana State Museum. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming to the Tennessee Williams Festival and all those kinds of things. This gentleman here is Chris Thomas King, guitarist, songwriter extraordinaire, and also now, as you can see from this prominent book put prominently right here, author.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to talk about the book, and I'm going to get you to kind of talk about and explain what the book talks about and what your ideas, and because for those of you who don't know, it is a pretty radical view. Well, we'll explain. That it's a different kind of view of how one, blues, and two, quote unquote, the blues, which I think are two different things, came about. But well, the first question I want to ask you is, how did you come to write this book?
Well, I came to write the book when we had a juke joint in Baton Rouge called Tabby's Blues Box and Heritage Hall, and that was the family business. We had that place since I was a teenager. It opened in 1979, and so for 25 years that was the family business, the juke joint business. And then the city of Baton Rouge decided they needed to raise the place, or demolish it to build for progress, to build a bridge. And it was around that time that I started getting the idea that something great is going to be lost, a cultural, iconic place, and a place that brought all kinds of people from all kind of walks of life together to dance and enjoy this music. It had made such an indelible impression on me, not only as a musician, but just, culturally, that I knew that somehow I needed to capture that memory. Now, moving forward, I was living in New Orleans at the time of Katrina, and it was during that period when I had to leave New Orleans. A lot of musicians left New Orleans, and we knew that New Orleans would change in some way. We didn't know how. That's when I think it got serious. And at that same time, my dad was not doing so well, and we began to try to capture his stories, and a folklorist would capture would interview him on his good days and stuff. And I thought I would be writing a memoir. But as I began to research the story of the blues, I just have to say it. I mean, I realized that the blues did not have a history. And that sounds kind of nuts because there's thousands of books out there, talking about the blues, but most of them are based on myths or they have tons of obfuscations in them.
Right.
So as I began to gather some facts about, primary evidence about where this music came from, what this music mean, how it connected to a community, then I realized that this is going to take longer. It's going to be a more difficult task. And it took 10 years to do the research and to put the book together. And so it came out, the full title is The Blues, the Authentic Narrative of My Music and Culture. And the key thesis of the book is that the blues started in Louisiana, not in Mississippi.
Ba-dum-bum. Now, what led you to come to this conclusion?
Well, in all of my research, I could not find, at the time that the blues was being played here in Louisiana in the 1890s and began to kind of coalesce into a certain style here in New Orleans in the 1890s. There really was no, they say that, you've heard the thing, the blues came from the Mississippi Delta, that's the land of the blues or something that Alan Lomax dubbed it. But I couldn't find any black people there. I couldn't find people almost in what they call the Mississippi Delta, northern Mississippi. The only thing that was there at that time that the blues was happening in Louisiana were black bears and Florida panthers and wild wolves, and a lot of cane breaks. And I learned, and people see these images of people picking cotton on the Dockery plantation and places like that, which I've visited a few times. I've had been there with the family and stuff. They, contribute to all kinds of, musical endeavors and stuff that, perpetuate the Delta blues thing. But there's no history of black people being in the Mississippi Delta. There was never any slaves there. There are no slave cabins in the Mississippi Delta. There's no church. There's no school. There's no grave sites. There's no burials. There's no pottery. There's no harmonicas laying in the ground someplace. It just never happened. It's just a myth. So unless Native Americans created the blues, because that was their land, the Chickasaw people, before they were moved out of the Delta, to Oklahoma during the Trail of Tears, unless they created it, then there weren't any people there. There were more black bears in the Mississippi Delta than there were black people to create something called the blues. So we're not even discussing what kind of music they were playing there. It just never happened. It's just
Right, because
it's just a fairy tale.
Because back then the land had not been cleared to plant cotton or sugarcane or whatever they
Right.
else were doing.
Right, and in the book I did write about the first black pioneers into the Mississippi Delta in a place called Mount Bayou.
Right.
Around 1890, 91, 92, they bought some land from the railroad tracks, from the railroad company, and they began to, but first you got to clear the land, you got to chop down the trees, you got to begin to cultivate it, and then they divided lots and sold them. So there was a black community in the Delta called Mount Bayou. But as far as the Dockery plantation, where a lot of people say the blues began, when Buddy Bolden was playing the blues here, and when Mamie Des Dunes was playing the blues in New Orleans, when Jelly Roll said he heard Mamie Des Dunes playing, a song she'd written called 219 Blues, when he was a kid, and we're talking, the 1890s at least, there was no Mount Bayou. There was no, I just got to say it again, there just wasn't any people there to make a music called the blues. And let me define to you what in the mythology of the blues, and I'll use the word mythology because a lot of this stuff I have to put in quotations, but northern Mississippi, in other words, Vicksburg is not considered the Delta. Jackson, Mississippi is not considered the Delta. The Delta is anything above Highway 20 that runs across from Jackson to, say, Vicksburg. Anything above Highway 20 was not even the state of Mississippi. It didn't become the state of Mississippi joined America in 2018, I believe. I mean, in 1918, I'm sorry. 1819, something like
No, they just
1818?
No, it's the 14th Amendment that they ratified in 2015. That's true, by the way.
Well, it's confusing. It's confusing. Honestly, and I wrote this in the book, Mississippi didn't enslave, they didn't ratify the end of slavery. I was 50 years old when they ended slavery in Mississippi. And that's a fact. I think they ended it, ratified it in 2012, if I'm not mistaken.
But you were talking about Highway 20.
So okay, yeah, so so we can move to another subject. The northern, so when Mississippi became a state and became a part of America, there was no, it ended, the state of Mississippi, the northern state line ended pretty much where Highway 20 is. And it wasn't until after the Trail of Tears that it went up, below Memphis
Right.
and near Arkansas. And so this idea that blues came from enslaved people in the Mississippi Delta, first of all, it didn't come from slavery. First of all, there was no slavery in what we call the Mississippi Delta. And all the musicians who play the blues, like Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, Son House, or whoever you want to, Charlie Patton, none of those people were born in the Mississippi Delta. Like Robert Johnson was born south of Jackson, like in southern part of Mississippi. And that's not considered the Delta. Now, what is the Mississippi Delta? We're sitting in it. This is the Mississippi Delta, people. And we never say it here in New Orleans, but we were built by the river. Mark Twain said that, you know, from Baton Rouge to New Orleans was built by the silt of the river. We're like the Nile in Africa, you know, Egypt was built by the soot of the river that spills in. I mean, if we didn't, when people were standing in their houses doing Katrina, if you don't know that you were built by the river from that and that you're a Delta, I don't even know how to explain it to you. But we are the Mississippi Delta. What you heard, we are the Mississippi Delta blues. This is the Mississippi Delta, and up there in northern Mississippi, if it's anything, it's maybe the Mississippi Valley.
Mm-hmm. Right, because the hills, as I've been there, you know, start at, you know, Winona and Mississippi and go all the way down. For those of you who haven't been to the Mississippi Delta, there's a moment where if you are going anywhere kind of east to west, you go down the last set of bluffs and hills, and it is flat for 200 miles. There's a few Indian mounds, and that's about it in terms of hills. It's like here. Because, again, this is the Mississippi River Delta, just like that's the Mississippi River Delta.
And I know a lot of people, I'm a musician, and I know a lot of people, when you ask them what the blues is, they talk about a 12-bar progression and of some kind of blues scale or something like that. And I don't use those terms because most people aren't musicians and most people don't read music. So the blues as we know it is defined more by kind of like a sociological definition. Okay. You know, it's the folklorists, the musicologists, and sociologists, they're the ones who really defined what we consider to be blues. And yeah, so I think.
Well, how do you define, how do you define blues?
So let's deal with some definitions, yeah. So what's important to know is that when you hear the early New Orleans people from the 1890s up until about the time that this music began to make it onto record, which is the 1920s. So for the first 30 years or so, the first 25 to 30 years of this music, the New Orleans musicians called their songs and called their music and spoke of their music as playing as the blues. You know, I can name a few songs like 219 Blues, Jelly Roll Blues, West End Blues, Basin Street Blues, and I can go on and on. I can be up here for an hour talking about it. They all call their songs the such and such a blues. Nobody said the Jelly Roll Jazz or the West End Jazz, which they could have. They could have named it that, but the word jazz didn't exist in New Orleans in the 1890s and early 1900s when they were creating this music.
Right, it was either called blues or it was called ragging or ragtime.
Yeah, and when you try to chase down the word jazz, which is a nonsensical word, and I can get into why the blues in New Orleans is called jazz. We can talk about that too. It's very important to know that. But there were, so the definition of blues, as far as just the word in Louisiana, where most people spoke a kind of Creole or French, it's a French definition, and it has a moral definition as well. So in Louisiana, when the Protestants came in and created things like blue laws, saying there's no, where people, the free and enslaved people in Louisiana, ever since the 1700s, would go to a place called Congo Square, not far from here, and play their music, have their market, dance, do their thing. And today we still do that at Jazz Fest. You know, Sundays at Jazz Fest is just one of the biggest party in America. But the Protestants came in and said that you can't dance on a Sunday. And the alcohol you're drinking, you can't drink alcohol, and you cannot gamble, and you cannot, and all these rules was pinned up on doors everywhere. These were blue laws. And a lot of us still live in communities where there are blue laws and where you can't go to the grocery store and buy a bottle of wine.
I grew up in a place where there were blue laws.
Yeah. So long story short, the blue laws and the blue music, we don't allow blue music here. This is blue entertainment. And there was a place in Louisiana, you might have heard of it, called Storyville. And in Storyville, you can't get much bluer than Storyville.
Yeah.
You know, so this was New Orleans was the the capital of blue entertainment and blue whatever, and this was blue music. This is the music that was incubated in this community that was pretty open and bohemian when it came to, expressing yourself or having some freedom and things. And a lot of that is because you have the Catholic background, which we're not going to get too deep into the religious thing, but you have the Catholic and Protestant battle is kind of part of that as well. But New Orleans, our most religious expression is really at Mardi Gras. And you can't get no bluer and more wilder than Mardi Gras. So we just do things different down here. And the drums were never banned in Louisiana. And so what we find is that Northerners who maybe, when they're talking about the black experience, black people this and enslaved people this and that, they're talking about what happened in the British colonies, not necessarily what happened in the Spanish colonies like Louisiana, where a lot of people had a lot of freedom. You had free black people. There was a 100-piece black orchestra in Louisiana, had their own theater in the 1830s. And that's not I didn't misspeak,
No, that there was all
Yeah.
sorts of,
Yeah. And
black
so
and African American, well, wasn't African American necessarily then, but black folks doing those kind of things.
Right. And so this 100-piece orchestra and having an opera and doing all these kind of compositions and things like Edmund Dede and people like that did, during slavery, at the height of slavery, you had all these free black people who had the leisure and the income to support a 100-piece orchestra, which we can't do today. Now, so when the blues came along with King Oliver and Buddy Bolden and them, this was a minimalist movement, meaning that they wanted to be nimble, and the music moved into honky-tonks, into, these places of vice and gambling dens and things like that, and some of the brothels and things like this where the piano players would play, people like Jelly Roll. And so it was a minimalist movement, and this idea that the blues began in the countryside or in some primitive place out there, and the definition of it being the Anglo definition when you look in the Oxford Dictionary is as sad, as down in the dumps, as depressed, and all this stuff here, which is totally different from sacre bleu, or blue entertainment, a sacre deal, So when the people in New Orleans, the good Christian people, would play a song like when the saints go marching in, it didn't sound like that. They sung it very serene and, very straight ahead. But then when the Black Creole people got a hold of it, they made it like a Saturday night anthem. And you know what happens on Bourbon Street when people play that tune? It gets nuts. And they would say that's the devil's music. So this whole idea that it's the Mississippi Delta music, you're talking about New Orleans. The whole idea that this music is somehow antithetical to the church because it's enlightenment music, it's about freedom of expression. And it's the devil's music because it's the soundtrack to all of this vice that's going on. All of these things come out of New Orleans. And even when you go up to Robert Johnson's story, which is another myth, that he sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads. And of course, I played a character Simulus that had an older brother.
Robert Johnson in that movie.
So, I guess I have contributed to this myth as well. But Robert Johnson, was a brilliant player, but he was like a third generation. He's not the original. The main point that I'm making here is that the blues, you got to come out of the Louisiana context and understand that it came out of Louisiana and that only Louisiana could incubate it. When Jelly Roll Martin was playing in a brothel and his mentor, Tony Jackson, was playing in a brothel, there weren't these brothels, these upscale brothels, there weren't black women in these places. These were butt-naked white women all over the place. And Jelly Roll playing his piano, and there was no hanging. No black people were hung because there was some naked woman in the place. You could only do that in New Orleans. at that time.
And that's part of what eventually was one of the reasons Storyville shut down, is that as this place became more American, the Americans from North started saying, we can't be having that. So, yeah. Anyway, go on.
I don't want to get too
Well,
risque up here. You guys get the
Well,
picture. I don't want to paint too,
One thing I want to ask, two things I want to ask. The first is that
I just want to make it clear that when people say we're playing the blues, there's nothing wrong with playing the blues with the Anglo definition of sad down in the dumps tune. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that that's not the origins of it, and that's not where it comes from. The word blues is more, like I said, a creolization of a French term called sacre bleu.
you've been speaking about what the blues meant to folks not from here and not in the culture who was making it. Mm-hmm. What did the blues mean to the folks in that culture, in the Creole culture, and the musicians who were making it, not only as a music, but as a kind of, cultural significance and understanding?
I'm sorry. Run it to me again.
What did the blues and playing it and the aesthetic mean to the people who were listening to it and who were making it?
Okay. Let me give you a quick little definition. When I say Creole, because Creole can be, you're going to West Louisiana now, and then you go to Creole restaurants that, used to be called Cajun and things like this. And, when I would go to West Louisiana as a kid, most people didn't even speak English. They kind of crossed over into making English their main language in the 70s and stuff. So people like Clifton Chenier and other people that comes from West Louisiana, they were still speaking French long after New Orleans had become Americanized. So what it meant to and when I use the word Creole, the Spanish called black people, even if both parents came from Africa directly to Louisiana, if the child was born in the Spanish territory, that child was deemed a Creole child. Of course, if you're Spanish and you're born into a Spanish colony, you're still Spanish. But what they meant by Creole is that this enslaved person would be more malleable. They'll probably learn the language and things like that, where it was a little harder to break, so to speak, Africans who came to Louisiana after their teen years or whatever. So, but anybody can call themselves Creole. It just kind of means a lot of different things, but it's like native to the land, or native to the territory. And everybody in Louisiana called themselves Creoles when when Louisiana was purchased by America, and the Anglo-Saxon Protestants came in and imposed their way of life on that Creole culture. Right. So I just wanted to get that definition out there. And what it meant to the black Creole people was, one of the things that really kicked this off is Plessy versus Ferguson. And most of us know about this issue, Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, we know a woman by the name of Mamie Desdunes, or we should know her, because she was the earliest songwriter is a woman. The earliest songwriter that Jelly Roll Martin heard doing the blues when he was living in the Garden District over there. Down the street from him was Mamie Desdunes, and her tune 219 Blues. Sometimes it goes under different names, but it's been recorded by Janis Joplin and all kinds of people. It's a very famous tune. And she's the earliest composer that Jelly Roll Martin said he knew of this style of music. And my book is the first book about blues that connects Mamie Desdunes to Rudolph Desdunes.
Who was her dad, right?
Right. And who is Rudolph Desdunes? Well, Rudolph Desdunes was the person who was in charge of forming the Citizens Committee and perpetuated the case, Plessy versus Ferguson, taking that case all the way to the Supreme Court. So his daughter was the first blues composer. They spoke French. They didn't really even speak English. And the newspapers that Rudolph Desdunes wrote for were French, black newspapers, but they were in French. And the first person before Plessy who did the train boycott and got a first-class ticket and sat in the first row was his son, Dan Desdunes, who was a trumpet player. And so this family, the blues begins really with this family. And Rudolph Desdunes he was a poet, he was a writer, he was an advocate, for the Creole people. And when he was fighting for the Creole people, he was fighting for a way of life that was being annexed, and being Americanized. And but he was fighting for all black people. Another thing to understand too, and why it's important for people from Louisiana to tell our own unique story, is because we can, we're not the same culturally. We're not better or anything like that, but we're just not the same as black people from the British colonies. We have a different culture and a different way of life and a way of being. The way we celebrate life, the way we celebrate death, the way we celebrate our religion, the way we express ourselves, the way we cook. Our culture is unique and different, and it's unique and different because we resisted Americanization. And it manifests itself in the way we express our music and what these early musicians call the blues. So that pretty much, I think, sums up the origin story that my book, says it's the origin story of the blues. Now, and I'm not a person who, my book is not the final, it shouldn't be the final say on this subject. I hope to write more, but I hope it don't take me another 10 years, but I would like to see other people write, and I'm hoping that some of you all who might have some questions might have some information that you might want to share that could enlighten us all. We're going to do a little Q&A.
Before we do, I want to just ask one more question. We can open it up. How did this, as you say, mythology of the blues coming up and starting and originating in the Mississippi Delta, and the Dockery and all that, how did that come about? Why do we think this instead of knowing that it, came from Louisiana?
I was waiting for you to ask that question. I have my note here because I want to be very precise in my language. The story that we have been told, he's asking how that story came about.
Why do we think that it started in the Dockery Farms 10 miles east of Cleveland, Mississippi, and Clarksdale where the crossroads are and all that?
Yeah. Now, we are going through, as a country, we're going through some stuff with books and with, what's real American history and what's propaganda and stuff. But you got to remember back, at the time that this music was originating out of New Orleans between the 1890s and the 1830s. The first person to really make a record that they called the blues in Mississippi Delta wasn't until 1929, and that was Charlie Patton. But that's 30 years after. People had been in New Orleans and gone. All the musicians that was doing this music and originated, they had hit the road after Storyville closed. They were gone, and it had already happened. The way the guys in the Mississippi Delta got this music is the phonograph records that made its way into the Delta. They would go to every plantation, like the Dockery plantation, would have a commissary store, and they would get paid in commissary money, and they would go there and gather around the phonograph, whoever had a phonograph, and there'll be a record peddler coming through every week or two or whatever. And that's where they first heard the New Orleans blues from, is from these records. They listened to a guitar player by the name of Lonnie Johnson, who is the king of Delta blues, and he's from Louisiana, he's from New Orleans, but he made over 130, 140 records before the first Delta musician was recorded. But he asked that a very important question, and I'm going to read this to you. I wrote this morning because I was like, how can I don't want to just ramble. So I want to get this more precise. So the way we got this story of the blues is the people call it primitive. It's a primitive expression of a primitive people. Keep that in mind. And so the question is, what is primitivism? And the answer is complex, and it requires some historical and cultural context to understand fully. Primitivism is an art style derived from a colonial myth that promotes the belief that primitive peoples in their unsophisticated behaviors were more noble and innocent than modern civilized people. It began in the late 1800s and dominated Western thinking throughout the 20th century. Photographer and historian John Edwin Mason was commissioned by the National Geographic a couple of years ago to sift through the magazine's past and evaluate how it portrayed people of color. He said, quote, "People of color tended to be portrayed as backward, as primitive, as lacking in technology and modern things in the National Geographic magazine. And as kind of stuck in the past, living much like their ancestors might have lived 200 or even 500 years ago." Mason went on to say, adding that when it came to the U.S., African Americans or black people were characterized as menial laborers, sharecroppers, or domestic servants, and almost nothing else. So what then is the blues? The blues in this narrative here that we've been sold, the blues is a musical expression of primitive people. The more primitive sounding, the more pure or authentic it was deemed to be. In other words, the National Geographic staged primitive pictures of natives and blacks, and similarly, folklorists and musicologists staged the audio soundtrack of National Geographic, meaning you would find them in prisons, recording prison chain gangs, and you would find them, these kinds of things is what criteria they look for in order to say that this is authentic black expression, meaning it's primitive. And like I said earlier, the Anglo definition of the word blues is feelings of melancholy, sadness, and depression. The myth of blues origin starts with Charlie Patton or Robert Johnson because their recording sounded most primitive. Then as blacks became more, this is the narrative, the mythical narrative, then as blacks became more civilized, their music became more Western. This allows for a paternalistic Anglo narrative of black music, and it perpetuates a white supremacy and black inferiority. And I'll finish with, understanding this, it's easy to see why New Orleans and early Louisiana bluesmen and women were written out of the blues origin narrative because New Orleans represented high culture, dating back as early as the 1700s, and had a large free black population that had its own theater and orchestra, even during slavery. And it was a proud black Creole culture that resisted Americanization. Moreover, the blues of New Orleans was joyous and celebrated freedom. It was not sad and depressing. And I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah. Just to finish that up, the funny thing is, if you listen closely to Robert Johnson and Charlie Patton, that's very sophisticated music and sophisticated playing. This is not, it's not primitive stuff.
I wouldn't say that about Charlie Patton. Charlie Patton did sound primitive, but he was a dilettante. He wasn't, and this wasn't his music. He was playing gospel music. His father was a lay preacher. Yeah. And then he recorded for Paramount, and that has something to do with how primitive he sounded, because they were the cheapest phonograph presses of everybody. So they used the cheapest wax and the cheapest process, and so their music sounded, you could barely hear what he's saying, because it was just so horrible.
Those Charlie Patton records, just too bad about that.
And now Robert Johnson, thankfully, he recorded for OK Records, which used the best wax, which recorded, pristine conditions and things like that. And so his music, you can actually hear what he's doing. Yeah. Charlie Patton was a dilettante, meaning an amateur, but he wanted to be like Lonnie Johnson. He wanted to get in on this blues thing. Who wouldn't want to get off those plantations and get to Chicago, right. So, but he was a primitive sounding musician, but these people have built Charlie Patton up beyond what he deserves, simply because he's the most primitive sounding of the early bluesmen, and he was on the Dockery Plantation.
Right, right.
And that is, that right there is why and they start with him, and then what's crazy, you watch the Ken Burns series on jazz, or you watch people try to tell this story, they'll go to Robert Johnson and Charlie Patton and go to the Mississippi Delta, and then they go and time travel back to New Orleans and tell you this is where Louis Armstrong got the blues and was playing. It's like it don't. When did Louis Armstrong go to the Mississippi to learn how to play? It just never, it's like it's a disconnect that and that's what took me so long, because I couldn't believe what I was finding, that it was just all made up, and it was made up to fit this eugenic narrative that, black people are primitive and inferior. Therefore, an authentic expression of them artistically would be primitive, a primitive expression. And if they started playing more sophisticated or complex harmonies and things and composing, let alone reading music, then they were acting white, or they were being more Europeanized. And so these folklorists would avoid recording those kinds of musicians. They only look for somebody who has some chains on, like Leadbelly, or he had to be on a chain gang. He had to be kind of, because that's the natural state of black folks. It's like if they don't have a chain on, you get confused. You know what I mean? It's like he's loose. He's loose. What are we gonna do? So this is some nutty stuff that John Lomax, Alan Lomax, and these people, when I don't want to get into it here, at some point I could get into it. If you really wanted me to, I could go deep into the eugenic stuff, because that's where the money came from.
It's also, there's part of that in the book too.
I went into, the Davenport and all these people, these eugenicists who funded a lot of this. I could go and explain to you how they got their funding and things like this, and how they would misdirect honest folklorists who were out there, like John Work, who actually discovered Muddy Waters and wanted to do field work, but couldn't get the grants and couldn't get the funding. And when he did get the funding, his project was misdirected and Alan Lomax put in charge. And then they go and create this primitive thing, narrative. And then he cuts John Work, who was a black folklorist and everything, cut him totally out of the story. Yeah. And everything I'm telling you guys, Jelly Roll Martin sat there and told Alan Lomax in 1938 at the Library of Congress. Told him everything I just said. And for 8 hours, we got 8 hours of recordings, played the songs, got on the piano and demonstrated 219 blues, told the story, and told him that the blues came from New Orleans and that W.C. Handy stole my music. W.C. Handy is a fraud. He stole my music. He told everybody that, and then they want to say that he's a kook. Something wrong with him. They put the word out that there was something wrong with Jelly Roll. And Jelly Roll told him all of this. And when Jelly Roll finished the recordings, you know what Alan Lomax did with the recordings? He went and told them, make sure you put this way deep down in the basement and hide it from anyone. And it didn't come out. These tapes and recordings was not released until 2002, after Alan Lomax passed away. And it won 2 posthumous Grammys for Jelly Roll Martin and exonerated him from being a braggart or a liar for telling people that New Orleans was a sophisticated place with a sophisticated music, and that the black people there, had grand lives and things. And he could demonstrate all this musically, but they didn't want that to be the narrative. They didn't want New Orleans to be a part of the story of the blues, because they had to, it messes up the narrative of primitivism. And you need the primitivism to justify, white supremacy and so on and so forth.
I would tell y'all, if y'all ever get a chance, and you should, listening to the entire, as much as you can, of the Jelly Roll Morton, Alan Lomax Library of Congress tapes and interviews is an incredibly fascinating thing and funny, and the music's great. It's really a great thing to listen to. It's also really good for long drives too. It's a good 8 hours worth of it, so you could really get it. But do we have any questions or comments for Chris on any of this? I know there's a lot. We've been talking about a lot and a lot of deep stuff, but go ahead.
I have one question about, you said Louisiana and the blues together.
Yeah.
My understanding is never really played the blues. You might use the flat seventh or flat third. They never used the blues or the flat fifth. So,
Yeah. Yeah, well, you got to find Louis in his own words. Most people say that he played jazz, and you got to understand what the word jazz, how it got into it. That's a good question, because it gets us to talk about how this stuff got to be called jazz. So like I said, the word jazz didn't exist when Louis was a boy and he was learning this music from King Oliver and them. And West End Blues that was written by King Oliver, which Louis took, and soared with in 1925, West End Blues. It wasn't called West End Jazz. It's called West End Blues, and it's a 12-bar blues if you want to go by 12 bars. I just don't use the 12-bar thing as being a definition for blues, because if you say, what is classical music? Well, how many bars is that? Or what about rock music? I mean, what are the chord progression for rock? No other music does that. But as far as Louis Armstrong playing a blue note, so Louis, so that's like the major. What he's talking about is that's like a major C. And to blue that, you'd be kind of bending between these keys. Classical music would be, that type of thing, but the blue notes would be. Let me play a little bit for you guys. Do we have I don't have a mic. But
Here.
yeah. Louis Armstrong only called this music the blues, in his own words. And you can find recordings of him on Spotify talking about his mentor, King Oliver, and he never called himself a blues. And after I play this song, we're going to talk about why this music is called jazz and how that came to be. But just keep in mind that if I say I'm playing hip-hop and somebody else say, no, you're playing rap, we're talking about the same music. Rap and hip-hop is interchangeable. For a certain period of time in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, blues and jazz is interchangeable. Like when they say Billie Holiday, lady sings the blues, but then people say, oh, she was a great jazz singer. It's really, we're talking about the same thing. But the dominant thing is it's the blues, because I don't know what the hell jazz is, to be honest with you. As musically, it has no definition. Blues, I can tell you what it is socially, politically, musically, and on and on. Jazz has no meaning in any African, the word don't exist in any African language, and there's thousands of them. Creole people, black people in Louisiana didn't know the word jazz, and we're going to talk about that before we get out of here. This is a song I wrote as an ode to my dad's juke joint that I grew up in, and about some of the colorful characters in the place. Normally I'm on the guitar, but this is convenient. We got a piano. There was Raven, Silas, and Kelly, and don't forget Henry Gray. When he played his piano, he put a smile on your face. Behind the bar, there was a great big pistol, 'cause David Thomas didn't take no job. Don't start no trouble and they won't find you down by the riverside. Tabby's Blues Box down on the bayou. That's where we went to have a good time. So don't start no trouble and you'll still be a friend of mine. you still be a friend of mine. Tabby's Blues Box down on the bayou, that's where we went to have a good time.
That was nice. Thank you. Other questions before? Yes.
Yeah, so if you met the person and never heard of Jeff,
How'd you explain the difference between between blues and jazz to someone who's never heard it?
Somebody that's never heard either music, that's an interesting one. I would say that it's not something you can explain musically in words. You just have to kind of hear it. You have to, the thing about a culture, you got to kind of experience it. So if we understand that it's a cultural expression, and the reason we know it's a cultural expression that's unique to Louisiana is because even today in 2023, no other state in America really matches our musical, cultural, we hold music in very high regard here. And there is no rules to what notes you could play or whether or not you can play a pentatonic scale or what they call a blues scale, or this and that. Those things were Western ways of trying to explain what these people were doing musically. And this idea that the black musicians couldn't read music or didn't write music or they weren't legit players and things, these are fictions because, as we said, you know, there was a 100-piece black orchestra in the 1830s and 40s here in Louisiana, mostly of free people, that played all of these instruments that you see in the European orchestra. So all these stories that we've been told, we have to kind of unlearn those stories about the Delta and the primitivism and things like that. And we have to accept that New Orleans is where this music came from. We can't define it the way that they define it because in our juke joint at Tabby's Blues Box on a Saturday night, we might play a 12-bar tune, but we might play a melancholy tune. But Louisiana and New Orleans is not, and even black people in general, didn't invent sad songs. I mean, they go back, they're ancient. I'm sure in ancient Rome they were singing a sad tune. So if that's the definition of blues, then we didn't invent that. If that's your definition of a sad song. And then they talk about work songs. Mm-hmm. And we kind of know what a work song is. But I would tell you that I'm kind of into pirates, and my wife tells me not to talk about pirates on stage. But pirates sang work songs. When you're rowing those boats out there, you got to row in unison, and you got Irish people and pirates and all kinds of people. They sung sea shanties. And so, you know, enslaved people in America didn't invent work songs. They're just a means of how to communicate and get the work done in a rhythmic way. So we can't use like these definitions that these folklores, what we can salvage from people like John Lomax. He recorded Leadbelly, which Leadbelly may not have been recorded. Yep. He helped bring, the Lomaxes helped bring Muddy Waters to the attention of people. We may not have had all that great music that he made. So they made a contribution, but what we have to do is we have to put aside their Jim Crow era educations of, you know, that Western culture is superior and all of this stuff here, and primitive peoples around the world, or, you know, some other species almost, and they describe the descriptions is what we have to throw out, and we have to update. The way they described it, we have to go in the archive and examine these recordings and re-examine this music, because it had no counterweight. Nobody argued with John Lomax. If the man come down from Harvard, Harvard-educated man, and that's the problem, Harvard, when it comes to folk music. That's the epicenter. They have miseducated everybody when it comes to. But the man, he comes down from Harvard, and he comes to the plantation, this big white man with all this power, or he comes to the prison, and he tell you, hey, man, and he got a reputation. Some of the prisoners are saying, man, he got lead belly out of prison, you know, when he was singing. You think they're going to be arguing with this man about what kind of songs? They trying to get the hell up out of, they doing hard time. It's like, what song you want me to sing? Well, how
You're
long
gonna play it for the warden so he can pardon me, like you did Lead Belly? You know,
how long you been playing the blues? Oh, I've been playing the blues a long time, boss. I've been playing, you know, whatever you want me to say, man. I'm trying to get up out of here, you know. So, and then if you argue with the man, no, you know, you might be illiterate, you know, you're a murderer, or you doing hard time. Who knows what? You know, some people were in prison. We know that there were lease programs and all this other stuff here. Some people were there for jaywalking, doing on chain gangs and stuff. You know, so I'm just saying we have to go back where that's the difference between this book right here. It's in the voice of someone from the culture. It's in the voice of someone who plays the music, and it's a first. There were no, outside of Leroy Jones's book, Blues People, a couple other writers, there really wasn't anyone from the South or anyone, any black blues musician that I could go to and really get a history, because it just didn't have a history. And all that we have been doing is copying what the Lomaxes and people like that have done and laid down, and just kind of regurgitating that.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Question on styles of music that were influential, like what some people might call American rumbas, tangos, and just what you just played on your piano a few minutes ago, like, and how that role played a big part in what would be music that people love to dance to, as well as personify the story.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's what Jelly Roll said in his Library of Congress recording. He said the blues has a Spanish tinge, and it makes sense because Louisiana, even though we spoke French and even though it has this French thing, it was a Spanish colony longer than it was a French colony. And that instrument that was in Congo Square, if you look at the images that was drawn from about 1818 or so, these are, a lot of these people call it a banjo. And it's not a banjo, because a banjo is like a drum. It's a, you know, flat skin instrument, you know, with the strings. You know what a banjo looks like. But a guitar has a sound hole in the middle of it, an acoustic guitar. And when you look at the drawings at Congo Square, and we're talking about black scholars, white scholars, we're talking about everybody have looked at that image and said that that's a banjo. And when you think about the banjo, it takes you to West Africa, you know, the banjo and other instruments like that. And it takes you to West Africa. However, when you realize that that's a guitar in Congo Square, you know, 200 years ago that somebody, an eyewitness, drew, what is a guitar doing in Congo Square? That takes you to Spain. You got to go back to Spain for the guitar. That's where everybody knows. But then when you get to Spain, you find out that the rumba and these other rhythms and some of even the gypsy dances and things like that, a lot of this comes out of Northern Africa. And so I trace the guitar all the way back to ancient Egypt. The oldest guitar that we know of on record that's I think in the British Museum is an ancient Egyptian guitar called the tanbar. And it's about maybe 4,700 years old. And if you don't believe it's a guitar, the guy was buried with a guitar pick on his neck. So it was a guitar. It wasn't a violin. It was a guitar. But the Africans brought that guitar into Spain in the 800s and AD. And I wrote about that guitar traveling out of Africa into Spain. And of course, in time, it made it throughout Europe. But when you go back to to these to southern Spain, and you guys know some of these places. It's very Africanized, and the music is intertwined with the whole Spanish and African thing, and so you get what he called like that little boom, 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 boom. They have the New Orleans blues has a different little Spanish bounce to it, and it has that rumba feel, and it goes throughout a whole lot of songs, like Fats Domino. You know, you always hear that triplet. That's the other thing, the triplet. You know, you always see that in the New Orleans too. But this right here, as opposed to New Orleans blues, like Professor Longhand, piano players like that, they're gonna put that little rumba. I'm not a great piano player, but I can demonstrate some things. So you'll get the guitar boogie woogie stuff. This came after the rumba thing. That was the early way that Jelly Roll and them played their rhythm and put their blues around it. Later, the people in the Delta adapted that. But like I said, a lot of these people were amateur. They didn't play music full time. The New Orleans musicians didn't do it. I don't think did Louis Armstrong ever had any other job but playing the trumpet. These people in New Orleans, they were bohemian. They were poor bohemians, city dwellers, but all they did was music. Music was their whole lifestyle. They might have had a menial job here and there, but the people in the Delta, you just don't have time to develop your skills when you're working sun up to sundown, 6 days a week. Oh, thank you, thank you. The Dixieland Jazz Band is where the New Orleans music became the New Orleans blues. It was New Orleans blues until these Sicilian boys recorded Dixieland Jazz. And when they recorded Dixieland Jazz, they became the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And the song that they had a hit with was Library Stable Blues, the 12-bar blues, and 2/4 time. It sounds very jumpy and very quick. That, as they got a fan club, that fan club wanted more songs that sounded like the Dixieland Jazz Band. So do you have any more of that Dixieland Jazz? And that stuck on, they were the first to record this sound and have some success with it in 1917. And it wasn't until about 7 years later or so that the New Orleans musicians started to get to record. But at the same time, America did not want the blues to become America's music. America was still kind of copying Europe and didn't have its own unique cultural music. And they did not want it to come from, swarthy people and down here in the South. And they thought this music was foul because it came out of brothels and there was prohibition. You couldn't even drink beer in the 20s. So, this music was kind of outlawed, and they didn't want it to be mainstream. So in order to get the music into theaters, in order to get the music into different venues, you would call it jazz, or you would call it swing, or you would go along with the program, and whatever you needed to call it in order to get it in. And I just like to say sometimes that so basically, Dixieland Jazz, and then they dropped the word Dixieland because we know that Dixieland, even during just a few years ago, people that had businesses called Dixieland and things like that, and the Confederate flag and all this, this whole movement. We took down these Confederate statues here in New Orleans, and all of this movement about having a reckoning with the lost cause is essential to the original Dixieland Jazz Band calling themselves the Dixieland Jazz Band. And I write about this. When I say that they were Sicilian, I'm just kind of explaining that Sicilians were not considered white people at this time. And New Orleans had done a number on Sicilians here in the 1890s. They were treated even worse and lynched even more than black people in some instances. So they were trying to integrate into mainstream America. And what better way to do that than to call yourself the Dixieland, not the Creole Jazz Band, like everybody else from New Orleans called themselves the Creole Band. That meant black. So they called themselves the Dixieland Jazz Band, meaning that we're aligned with the Lost Cause. We're aligned with this whole movement of white superiority, black inferiority, and that type of thing there. And then they crowned Nick LaRocca and his band, they crowned him the king of jazz, the king of Dixieland jazz in the 1930s. And on YouTube, you can pull up old videos, commercials of this. And if you go deep down, you can find this man was pretty racist, pretty bitter and stuff in his old age, saying that all the black people stole the music from him and so on and so forth. But that's where the word came from. And then New Orleans in the 1960s, New Orleans, at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, New Orleans decided that they would embrace Dixieland jazz, that term, to make New Orleans kind of a Disneyland for tourists, where there were happy black people and there were riverboats, and this is the gay old South. Come on down to New Orleans to Dixieland jazz, and then they got some white faces playing the blues, which we call Dixieland jazz, Al Hurt, and these people, and it was successful. It made money. It got the French Quarter, to be a major tourist attraction. But what we have done in New Orleans and what we have done in Louisiana is we've orphaned the blues. We've allowed Mississippi to redefine it. We've allowed Chicago, Memphis, anybody else can take this. I was in Russia, and they had blues clubs in Russia and stuff. But here in Louisiana, we have orphaned this culture and orphaned this music, and this is the most popular music in the world today. We're in the blue era. There's been a romantic era, and this era, and a classical era. We're in the blue era. We've been in the blue era ever since Jelly Roll Martin left New Orleans. And I would just like us to call ourselves the Mississippi Delta every once in a while and remind people that we are the Mississippi Delta. And we were built by the river, and we might be swallowed by the river one day if we don't get our act together. But we are the Mississippi Delta. We do play the Mississippi Delta blues. Mississippi Delta blues came from here. And when people say, well, wait a minute, what about Muddy Waters and this and that? Muddy Waters, we talking 1942. That's 50 years after the people had already been here and gone with the music. And the last little thing, this don't have to be the last thing. I'll answer questions as long as you guys want to stay here, but I do have some books back there that I'll be happy to sign for you on your way out. The other little thing is, when you hear all this voodoo imagery in Mississippi blues, Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads. This is voodoo that comes out of New Orleans. Even the whole idea of voodoo and mysticism and got my mojo working and my mojo hand and all that, we're still talking New Orleans culture. Jelly Roll Martin wrote a song called Muddy Water. At the time, Muddy Waters might have been about 10 years old, and he ended up getting a name called Muddy Water. And he was called Muddy Water, not Muddy Waters with an S. He was called Muddy Water until after he was a grown man and moved to Chicago. I think nobody asked him, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was named after that song, Muddy Water. And Spencer Williams, a New Orleans writer, wrote the first song called the Delta Blues. Yeah. Even the Delta Blues composition that was in W.C. Handy's first book in 1925 was written by a New Orleans person. Yeah. So no matter where you try to connect the dots, everybody that played the blues in the 1920s or knew how to play it, from Duke Ellington to, Rhapsody in Blue, or whatever it was, no matter how sophisticated they got, or how raw it got, like Charlie Patton and stuff like that, they had to come across and meet a New Orleans musician like Jelly Roll or somebody, or John Lee Johnson, or they got a hold of these recordings and studied these recordings like Robert Johnson did, and then rewrote these songs or copied the songs note for note or lyric for lyric. And that's how we got what we call the Delta Blues. The problem that we have as Americans is we go from primitive to civilization kind of thing, and we're looking for the most primitive record, and that had to be the first one. And it doesn't roll that way, so.
we have to go. You're going to hang out for a little bit to talk about this and sign books, right?
I am here to sign books, and so we can wrap up.
I want to end this just because as we're talking about, as you've been saying, there was a great rhythm and blues singer who you probably have heard of named Ernie Cato. And Ernie Cato was famous for many things. But my favorite quote of his is he said, "I'm not sure, but I'm almost positive that all music comes from New Orleans." And the more I study, the more you study, the more I start to figure, you know what? That's kind of true. So anyway, Chris Thomas King, give it up for him.